It's the week ending Saturday the 3rd of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Joe Biden under attack in the second Democratic debate, the pound plunging to a 28-month low as a no-deal Brexit becomes more likely, and the first Ashes test beginning at Edgbaston. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, we have boss man Holden Frith, Hollie Clemence, and Cameron Tait. And starting the show this week, it is Holden. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Here's why we should be asking who controls the controllers.
So that's where having connected aircraft become very important. So if you know all the time where all the aircraft are, then you can speed up, slow down. You can actually virtually glide into land. So from an environmental impact perspective...
just take me through this, Paul. What's the technology here?
Well, the technology is a whole combination of technologies coming together. So it's basically having the air traffic control system integrated with the aircraft. So the aircraft knows where it needs to be to land at precisely the right second. So at the moment, air traffic control is basically done by people talking to each other. And so by moving to a secure system where computers are talking to each other and getting the aircraft to land at the right exact time. And the technology is absolutely there to do that today.
Paul Kahn from the technology consultancy Cobham speaking to Evan Davis on The Bottom Line last week. And Holden Secure is the operative word there, isn't it? Tell us why.
Because 2 days after that broadcast, which was, as we just heard, talking about the way you could have aircraft being guided into land by remote control, the US Department of Homeland Security issued an alert saying it was possible that hackers could gain unauthorized access to some aircraft and take control of them remotely.
But for that potential security breach to be a threat, the hackers would need physical access to the plane. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a couple of reassuring provisos to this story, one of which is that we're talking about smaller planes rather than large passenger airliners. And the other is, yes, they would need to physically get inside the plane, fit a remote receiver to it. But the clear concern here is that these planes could be turned into some sort of flying weapon. And more concerningly, there have actually been security vulnerabilities discovered in larger airliners. One case was in 2015. The FBI said a security researcher called Chris Roberts, who was flying as a passenger on a Boeing 737, managed to hack into the engine management system and change the course of that aircraft while he was on it. He initially seemed to be boasting about this, or possibly joking about having accomplished this. He then denied it, and there is some lack of clarity still about exactly what happened in that case. But what is undisputed is that a couple of years later, security experts working again for the Department of Homeland Security did manage to hack into a Boeing 757.
I mean, Cameron, there's nothing new here in a sense. You know, the Internet of Things has been around as a concept for over 10 years, I guess, and all along the way, people have had the spectre of, imagine if you took control of a plane and downed it over a big city. It hasn't happened yet, and with the kind of pressure that's on Boeing at the moment, following the scandal over the 737 MAX, it sort of seems to me like, and the Department of Homeland Security are dealing with it too, people are on this.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a couple of reasons as to why no one's really been talking about this before. Cybersecurity is very much in the spotlight at the moment, and it has been in recent years, mainly because we're seeing huge organizations being hacked into by people in their bedrooms. We had it this week where Capital One, the US bank, had over 100 million people, their personal data was stolen by someone in their room. So it's becoming very much a real issue that didn't seem to exist about 5 years ago.
And didn't exist because the targets people could get access to seemed to be smaller. These big organisations seemed more protected.
Yes, that being the case, but it's also people are just becoming far more savvy to it. We've got to understand that the internet is a constantly evolving source, and the information for hacking into a large corporation probably wasn't as widely available 5 years ago as it is today. And hackers are incredibly creative people. So we are seeing it being done. I wonder if perhaps we would see someone that would hack into a plane but wouldn't necessarily use it as a weapon. Because you've got to understand, a lot of people hack not necessarily to gain a financial advantage, but because it's a challenge and they want to know that they are capable of hacking into a big organisation.
But it seems improbable, doesn't it, Holly, to think about, for example, those attackers on 9/11, if they had access to this kind of technology, not using it.
Yeah, and I think there are differences with this aviation story. Rapid7, who's the company that came up with the report that the Homeland Security have based this alert on, have said there's so much concentration on cars being hacked into that people have kind of overlooked the aviation side. And because it seems so unlikely that someone could physically gain access to a plane, they've kind of put it off, whereas maybe that paradoxically has made it more dangerous because they've kind of let it go and not focused as much as they have on cars. But also the terrorism side of it is obviously really scary, but then you've got to have that high mix of someone that is capable of hacking into it and has got the motivation to actually kill people. And like Cam says, there's been a lot of hacks to do with money and finance and people's information, but there haven't necessarily been physical attacks where it's, left somebody dead. So that's quite new.
But, I mentioned the Boeing scandal a moment ago, Holden. The solution to that seems to be making sure that all pilots are trained to override whatever the computer's trying to do. That's why those planes fell out of the skies. They weren't able to do that. So, presumably, with this warning, pilots of small planes, and I guess bigger airlines as well, are going to make sure that, indeed, a human can override whatever is being done maliciously anyway.
Yeah, so after the Boeing 757 vulnerability was exposed, there was then some technical work that was done to kind of shut that door, essentially, and make sure that vulnerability was closed. The Department of Homeland Security is now telling owners of small planes to follow those same precautions. But I think the broader point here is that there is a lot of work going on looking at automation of aircraft, air traffic control, how that can be used to more efficiently get a rising number of passengers from A to B without increasing emissions. And there are such large benefits to automation that I think it is going to happen one way or another. But what this really shows is that there's always going to be that payoff between partly a human desire to have another human being who is accountable and who can sort of wrest the controls back from the computer if the computer seems to be doing something it shouldn't. Even if more accidents are almost certainly going to be caused by human error than you would ever get through this sort of malicious access through hacking. But it feels as if we thought about the risks of self-driving cars crashing, or we thought about the risks involved in privacy of smart homes and connected services. But I'm not sure the idea of a malicious actor gaining access to an autonomous network has had the kind of attention it deserves, possibly because it sounds a little bit too far-fetched and a bit too much like the plot of a dystopian film.
Yeah, and is that possible, do you think, Cameron, that a hacker, you've talked about a hacker being able to get access to this kind of small plane once they put a physical device on it, but is it really possible that nightmarish sci-fi thing could happen where someone says, right, 200 planes, they're all going to crash into a field at the same time?
If you use an element of common sense, it does have a slight whiff of scaremongering about it, because the scenarios that need to be in place for you to gain control of these devices, not just a plane, but even your smart speaker at home, they're exceptional. It just is almost impossible that they would happen. So, for instance, we had, I think it was an Amazon Echo device that could be hacked into. It was discovered about 2 years ago of where someone, if they gained access to an Amazon Echo, they could put an SD card in it and they could override your Amazon Echo. But it would mean that you would need to break into somebody's house, physically get hold of their device and put something in it to overhear them. It also came out that when that news was released, it had already been patched. So you couldn't do it anyway.
One of the reasons it's really worth paying a lot of attention to these kind of questions is that cybersecurity is much more complicated and multifaceted than conventional airline security. And even in conventional airline security, there's always a weak link in a chain, and one event exposes it. So until Lockerbie, it was baggage handling in remote airports on connecting flights. You then have a shoe bomb attempt and everyone has to take their shoes off. And I think when you have this sort of connected setup, and particularly looking at this slightly more advanced and perhaps utopian idea of a connected city in which, if you have an early flight to get, your smart home will wake you up and make your cup of tea and make you toast and send you in an autonomous vehicle, and your smart tagged baggage will then propel itself through the airport to your flight.
I feel like I'm in tomorrow's world.
That just introduces a lot of different systems that all have to interlink with each other and potentially with the air traffic control system, because that's how they know when your plane is departing. And it doesn't have to be a malicious actor even. It can be a mistake in code that ends up creating a loophole that somebody with more malicious intent can exploit.
It does feel a bit like the world is behind in terms of the legal system and war, for example. Even on a nationwide scale, there's not really set protocols about cyber warfare. And if you look, there's been news this week about our army announcing the 6th Division. It's like the first dedicated information warfare formation, which seems a bit late to the game. If you're going to look at cyber warfare, it's been going on for years. You'd have hoped the governments have kind of got their act together on the laws and how they're going to deal with it. There's no Geneva Convention on cyber warfare. Things like this, if it did happen and there was a terrorist incident, it feels like countries wouldn't really know how to respond or whether they're allowed to retaliate or whether this is suddenly war footing. There's nothing in place. I think, like Holden says, it will be reactive. It will take something like that to happen before the world really kind of takes note.
Yeah, Cameron, legislation and regulation does seem to be behind the technology, doesn't it? I mean, we saw a drone shut down Gatwick Airport.
Yeah, definitely. But I think you need, like Holden and Holly were saying, you need events to happen for that to come through. And I think that we're actually seeing that coming through at the moment. I would say we're actually quite fortunate that massive banks and corporations are being hacked into, because it's not resulting in any loss of life. It's resulting in hundreds of millions of dollars being paid. But what it means is if we can have that happen on a smaller scale of where people aren't being injured, the regulation will hopefully come through, kind of pushing other tech companies to ensure that they've got a very, very high level of cybersecurity to maybe prevent planes being brought down in the future.
The cyber warfare aspect is a really good point, actually, because it's maybe easier to imagine some sort of state actor taking this sort of action in the way that the Russian government used computer viruses to shut down Ukraine's national grid. And you could easily imagine that they or some other foreign government would be very tempted at looking into air traffic control systems, maybe not to cause death and destruction, but just to shut down a country and shut down their airspace.
Quick question before we move on to all of you. In 20 years' time, if the technology is proven, if there haven't been any accidents, would you get on a self-driving plane, no pilot, no staff? Holly?
If other people had first.
Holden?
Yeah.
Cameron?
They pretty much do it now, so yeah, I would.
Absolute hard no from me. Okay, Cameron's up next after this. Okay, Cameron, Holden sort of stole your thunder with a very Cameron-ish story. What have you got for us? What do you think this week will be remembered for?
They say one rotten apple spoils the bunch.
I didn't sleep a wink last night. And I was so excited about today because we've been so lucky at Apple. We've had some real revolutionary products. The Mac in 1984 is an experience that those of us that were there will never forget. And I don't think the world will forget it either. The iPod in 2001 changed everything about music. And we're going to do it again with the iPhone in 2007.
Steve Jobs talking 12 years ago at the launch of the iPhone. And Cameron, some news out of Cupertino this week.
Yeah, we've had quite a big news story come from Apple. They've announced their latest quarterly earnings, which doesn't sound even remotely interesting on the surface.
That's the point of this show.
However, there's one key little fact that has come out of it, is that iPhone sales now contribute less than 15% of all revenue. And it's the first time that's happened since 2012.
So what's making up the difference?
Well, it's things like services. So you're talking your Apple Music subscription, so you pay £10 a month and you get access to pretty much all the music that you can think of. But it's also things like getting movies from Apple TV or downloading apps. So what Apple is really focusing on at the moment is, it seems like they're moving away from the iPhone and pushing everything towards your services, what you can get from your iPhone instead.
Okay, so what's the implications for everybody else? I mean, big hardware company moving towards services. Is that something we're going to see replicated across other industries as well, other tech sectors?
Yeah, well, what's really fascinating here is that because Apple is always at the front of the news, it seems like it's just Apple that this is happening to. But this is actually an issue that has waves across the industry. We also saw Samsung; they got really badly burned in their latest quarterly reports, and their phones are tumbling in sales as well. So it's kind of showing that people are either hanging onto their phones for longer, or B, they're fed up of paying thousands of pounds to go and get a smartphone.
I guess there's a monopolistic concern as well here, Holly, in that on the face of it, this seems quite democratic because Apple have always tied their software to their hardware. And now what they're doing with services is you can listen to Apple Music on Android, for example. You'll be able to watch Apple TV through a range of different brands of televisions. And yet, in a way, what they're actually doing is saying, we used to take a cut off people for selling their apps. Now we want all the market of everything you're consuming.
Yeah, I wonder if they're that bothered about this, because if you've got an Apple phone, you're going to have to use Apple services. So that is probably now the aim, is to get people to have the phones. Like in China, they've made it easier to have second-hand iPhones. They're not so bothered about, maybe, this is my prediction, getting revenue from the actual hardware, but they will need those phones so that they therefore buy Apple services. It's similar to IBM in the 1990s.
Go on.
Which kind of had to diversify because it's suddenly everybody was doing what it specialised in, and then it also had to kind of switch to software and services, and it had a rebirth. It lost millions and millions and then came back again. And
Microsoft as well, I guess, have basically done that, haven't they, Holden? They used to be not hardware, but they used to be licensed software, and now they're cloud and they're LinkedIn and their services.
Yes, and they give away a version of the software that used to make them all of their money, with the idea of they're aiming for that monthly subscription payment license fee from big business rather than upfront sales from individual users.
So under all of this, does it mean, Cameron, that actually we're happier with the phones we have in our pockets? There was exponential growth because they were a bit crap for a while. Now they're really good. You can keep your iPhone 6 or 6S. You don't need to get a new one every year.
Definitely. I think this is kind of been spun as a bit of a negative story in the press, but if you look at it, it's actually quite good for the consumer, because go back in the day, after 2 years, so you'd take out a 2-year phone contract, your phone would be rubbish by the end of those 2 years. It'd be completely out of date. Being the tech editor at The Week, I love technology. Give me a new phone every day, but when I had my last iPhone...
For the PR consultants listening there.
Yes, please. No, we're impartial. But I had an iPhone 6 back in the day, and I kept held of it for about 4 years before moving on to a newer device, because it was relevant. Apple has made sure that your phone will stay relevant for longer. Even their latest software updates have been designed to make older phones run faster.
Yeah, and that's better for the environment as well, isn't it, Holly? That's got to be a good thing. Less mineral mining, for example, less, glass being going into the screen, being flown across from China and all the rest of it.
That's true. But when you look at the numbers, it is still an enormous amount of phones. There's something like 900 million people using iPhones. That's like all of the people of America 3 times over. So it's still a huge amount. It's not like iPhones are just disappearing and Apple's never going to sell them again. I'm sure it will still be a large component of their business.
I think the negative side of what might feel like a positive of phones still feeling usable and current after 2 years is that's also a sign that innovation has dried up a bit amongst all of the phone makers. They've pretty much made the phones as good as they can be, and they all pretty much look the same and do the same and feel the same. And so I think there isn't the excitement around a new launch now in the way that there used to be a few years ago, when you'd expect a huge leap forward from each new model.
I mean, like it or not, the iPhone, when it came out in 2007, was properly revolutionary, and it changed the industry as we know it. But even if you look at a first-generation iPhone and the latest ones now, they haven't changed all that much in the way they look. Yeah, there's a few tweaks here and there, and they're obviously a lot faster. But they've not changed massively, and that has driven, clearly, Apple to go and diversify its revenues. But I kind of want to go back to a point you mentioned earlier, Ollie, about a monopoly. That's becoming a real fear at the moment, because you have Apple, and Google is doing a very similar thing, and Amazon is doing a very similar thing. Remember, Amazon was just an online retailer, and now they do smart speakers, they do tablets, they now do connected cars as well. So there's a real fear of it, and the US is actually probing it at the moment. They're looking into seeing whether these tech companies do have a monopoly, are swallowing up smaller companies and spitting them out the other side.
And for the consumer, are any of the new services coming down the pipe from Apple actually going to be useful? I mean, what is there? There's the TV stuff.
Yes, there's obviously a lot of entertainment, but the one I would say is is the most obscure is Apple Card. It's their attempt at creating a credit card. You almost have the Bank of Apple. So what that is it's free to sign up to. I'm not a salesman. It's free to sign up to, and you get cash back on certain things that you buy with it. So if you get the physical Apple Card and you buy something on it, you get 1% cash back. If you use the digital version on your Apple Wallet, you get 2% cash back. And if you buy anything in an Apple store, you get 3% cash back.
Well, that all sounds very convenient, but then if you don't pay your bill in full, presumably you're going to be in debt to Apple.
Yes.
That's a big change, isn't it, in terms of their consumer relationship model?
This is the really odd thing, is from as far as I can read into it, they don't have any penalties for late payments. So I don't know what would warrant a late payment. And there's no monthly fee of signing up to it. So I have yet to see what they get out of it.
Do they charge you interest?
Yes,
so
they do
it's
charge
basically
interest.
it's a credit card business model, which is a big transition for Apple, which has made its money mostly through physical devices. Although I suppose the iPhone itself was actually a pivot from what had been their core business of making computers. And, well, I suppose first of all there was the iPod, the MP3 player, and then they hooked that up with a phone and a camera. And I suppose, well, all of these businesses taking new directions seem inevitable in hindsight if they work. And if they don't work, they seem ridiculous. And you can easily imagine the Apple credit card being one of those things that falls by the wayside. And in 5 years' time, people think, what on earth were they thinking? Or we'll all have Apple credit cards in our pockets and it will seem like the most natural.
That's it. Because it's in your Apple Wallet on your phone, I think it will just be in there. And I think people will forget about it, but it will become integral. I think everyone will move over to it.
Different from the sort of current smartphone-based payment system?
Well, exactly. There's a reluctance, I sense, among some consumers to give all their money and information to Apple, isn't there, Holly? I mean, they've launched this credit card in response partly to lots of these new wave banking apps that make banking look pretty with lots of data graphs in a very kind of Apple-y sort of sensibility. Those companies exist. Why wouldn't you bank with one of them rather than Apple?
I think you might get a few people that are reluctant, but I'm not sure the majority of people might just go along with it because it's easier, and if they get discounts on their Apple products, they might just go ahead. I wonder if phones themselves, a big question to Cam, technology editor, whether phones themselves will carry on being that big thing that everybody has in their pocket, or whether it will be the watch, or they'll have to come up with a completely different device, whether people will get used to having all their information on their arm as a watch or something else rather than actually having a phone. Have we reached peak phone?
That's a really good question, and it's one that I can.
You sound like you're beginning a thesis. Keep it brief.
I'm going to tell you a little story. There's not a lot of facts I can bring to this, but if you look at, so I'm sat here talking to you lot with a laptop in front of me, and these have existed for 30 odd years. I don't see the phone changing drastically in its current form. I think they will stay. I think we've hit peak phone, but I don't see them vanishing anytime soon. Watches are still very convenient, but I think they're a little bit gimmicky. Sales are going up, but they're nowhere near as radical as an iPhone. You know, the iPhones, they like you said, Holly, they sell in the hundreds of millions, and we're not seeing that really with any other technology. So they're here to stay.
Or the Apple Car, which we keep hearing about, but keep seeing the launch date keeps receding from us into the future. It was originally a Steve Jobs project back in 2008, which I think he shelved because of all of the money and effort that was going into creating the iPhone. But Apple has been ramping up efforts again in recent years and hiring people away from Tesla, producing what is presumed to be an electric car and possibly a self-driving car to some extent. But there's a lot of questions surrounding how much progress they're making. They have made redundancies recently too, and the proposed launch date has slipped from next year to 2021.
I'm glad you mentioned Tesla, Holden, because we've got some unfinished business on that, Cam. How has your free ride with Tesla gone? We first talked about it on the podcast in February 2017.
Oh my God! Yeah,
have you managed to secure a trip with a Tesla yet?
No, I've been. I mean,
it was imminent then.
You know, they're an interesting bunch, a Tesla. I've driven lots of other cars though. Driven a few McLarens, a few Audi supercars. But
I'm just asking on behalf of the people that were wondering and left hanging. We've now super served all of the audience that would possibly be interested in that. So thank you for that response. One last story to come after this. And so finally this week, it is Holly. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is it time for more warts and all photography?
It wasn't really until I started photographing weddings and realised that I didn't want to photograph it in the way that it was traditionally done, that I started to look for another way to do it now. And that, I suppose, the wedding industry itself forced me to be a better photographer, because I didn't want to be the same as everything that I'd seen. And I didn't believe that there had to be some sort of timeline or rules or specific shots that I should get. And through my study into the history of photography, that gave me the freedom to go wherever I wanted and where I felt that I should be going as an artist.
Photographer Ian Weldon, interviewed last year by the School of Wedding Photography. And Holly, it's quite interesting because, he talks about there being an artist. Most wedding photographers probably don't. What's your story?
Yes, so he's got an exhibition on in Bristol showcasing his photographs of weddings, which are kind of the opposite of what you'd expect from a wedding photo album. There's families having cigarettes together outside, children's having tantrum on the floor, drunk guests lying down. And he's done an interview with CNN talking about how he's turned traditional wedding photography on its head. But I think this speaks to a wider backlash against overly staged photos online, but also weddings. Weddings are quite unique in that you have very kind of set ideas about what they might look like. It's also most people's best day of their life, and they've spent many months, if not years, working up to it, trying to look beautiful and how they want to look. So photography is quite a big part of it, but it's kind of that ultimate portrait that you might have on your wall. It's a lot to do with identity as well, and how you imagine yourself. So we've obviously got Instagram, which is, I feel there's a backlash kind of beginning against Instagram, against this overly staged pictures where people are looking top of their game and there's many filters on. I think there's a new desire coming through for more natural, if I say authentic shots.
I get that, and I've looked at these pictures that he's taken, and they are brilliant on the CNN website. You can see them, they're hilarious. But the pictures, including the ones you describe, some of them include the bride and the groom, an unflattering shot of the bride ironing her trousers or taking something off her dress or, bending over to pick something up. But that's not the wedding portrait, is it? I mean, you're talking as if the couples that commissioned this photographer are only going to have that picture of someone having a fag. They're not. They're still going to do the shot of the ring. They're still going to do the shot of the two of them standing outside in the sun and looking romantic. So the desire for the portrait hasn't gone.
Well, he's saying he literally doesn't do those shots. Like, he thinks they're overdone and those traditional shots kind of go out the window, and they've gone to him to request him. So maybe those couples are specifically asking for this.
Yeah, but I bet there's a photo where they look good.
Maybe. But yeah, it did make me question my own wedding, and I love my wedding photographer and pictures, but I did look at them in a new light thinking, we missed quite a lot of the end of the night, which would have made for some fun pictures. But I specifically didn't ask for her to cover that because I knew that they would kind of be, you want everyone to relax a bit. But I think there is, even online, there's people kind of flooding to these apps where pictures even look like they're not filtered, so you get a bit more grainy shots, so people are just not setting up the image just as much as they were once, maybe a few years ago.
Do you get the sense, Holden, that there's at least a savviness now about the likes of Instagram, as Holly suggests, that people realise that's not real life?
I think so, and perhaps there's the reason for this particular photographer wanting to move away from it is that the wedding photograph is probably the closest parallel to an Instagram picture that you would get from a professional photographer. It has that sort of staged quality. There's often a sort of filter on the image too that gives it that sort of slightly nostalgic air. But I agree that these particular photographs are amazing, and it's a brilliant set, and it looks like a fantastic time was had by everybody at the wedding. But I do think it's just as much of a created aesthetic as the standard wedding photograph set is. It's just a different sort. And you could easily imagine people who are getting married go out to photographers and start to ask for this sort of set. You'll get photographs that are equally contrived. They're just contrived to look as if they're candid rather than posed.
Yeah, so he's going to be hanging around waiting for the bridesmaid to yawn whilst looking at her phone and take that. Cameron, do you think social media is changing our attitude towards stage photography?
A little bit. I kind of actually wanted to give a little defense of Instagram, because I think we have we can generalize what we see on Instagram as everything is perfect, but it just depends on the accounts that you follow. You'll still have people with tens of thousands of followers that will have photographs that are like this. The ones on the CNN website, I mean, I'm looking at a woman who looks like she's falling over while having her dress ironed. Perhaps not as quirky as that, but that almost looks like someone who's got their iPhone out and just taken a picture at the wrong time. So I think you can find sincere, candid photography on Instagram. I like to think that my own Instagram account has candid photography. But in general, we are starting to see now that social media, what we see on it isn't the real world, and people are starting to cotton on to it.
But I suppose the point about the wedding, Holly, is that it is the one big opportunity in your life, most people's lives. I mean, some people get 2 weddings or 3 weddings, but, nonetheless, there's a few opportunities to have the perfect picture, which is symbolising something. But the thing about social media is that it's happening every day. People feel the pressure to look perfect and behave in a perfect way all the time.
And I think the history of wedding photos is quite interesting, because for about a century they were all taken in a studio because photo equipment was just so heavy and cumbersome to carry around. So people would literally go to pose and then go off and have their wedding. And then even when they did come along to your wedding, they had to set up a studio. So it's traditionally been a very posed photograph. But there's other parts of your life, like christening. There's this new trend for having a photograph after you've given birth, and you're expected to look beautiful after 24 hours in labour, and all these great expectations on these milestones in your life, which don't always sort of tally with Instagram, which is just this barrage of photos of every day. But I do think with technology we kind of take photos to create narratives about ourselves, but with Instagram, there's so many pictures, and the fantasy about how you think your life is now become so far-fetched for some people, whether you think about yourself in a very different way now compared to 10, 20 years ago, when maybe you just had a photo album in your house and you took it out every so often to look at pictures of you as a child, whereas you're confronting photographs of yourself every day. And if you're seeing that beautiful, filtered, dewy shot, you're genuinely, I don't know if it's good for self-esteem or bad when you're not the person that has that picture.
I think memory acts a little bit like an Instagram filter in itself, in that as you remember events, you tend to crop out the unfortunate bits that you wish didn't happen, and it has that sort of filter of rose-tinted filter of nostalgia on it. And sometimes when you are confronted with pictures of an event that you have very fond memories of, it maybe doesn't quite. I'm actually thinking of a specific work Christmas party which involved a lot of alcohol and a lot of karaoke. And in my memory of it, it was basically Wembley Arena. But this was pre-smartphone, so there wasn't the immediate kind of feedback of pictures, but somebody had a digital camera, sent the images around a few days later, and they were just hilariously bleak. Like there was about 6 of us in the worst pub in London, all doing very bad air guitar, and it wasn't really how I had pictured it in my mind. And maybe it would have been better if we'd kept those memories.
Well, maybe that was a real wake-up call to moderate your booze consumption.
Karaoke was the
moderate your karaoke consumption.
Karaoke was what I cut out of my life.
And TikTok has a role in all of this, don't they? So this is a social media that's really gaining traction, sort of doing the opposite of Instagram, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, TikTok started off as you would essentially have music that would play over the top, or a line from a movie, and you would mime it. Is that the
lip sync?
You would lip sync. That's it. It was a lip sync app. However, it has turned into this kind of platform of where people shoot these small videos, and they are showing a far more authentic side to them than you would see on Instagram. It's almost taken over the role of Vine a little bit. You'll remember Vine, the 4 to 6 second clips it used to get. So they're very, very brief clips, but we are seeing a more authentic view of someone's life through these things.
I hesitated over the word authentic as well, whether that is slightly dangerous to think that these are, just because they're grainier shots rather than the rainbow filters of Instagram, that we are seeing someone's real life, and whether that will be the new kind of go-to people for brands, as a lot of Instagram influencers are taking money from people to be that beautiful and show those filtered shots. Whether the next will be, look, I'm really genuine in my bedroom at home, but it's still completely staged and you're still selling whatever cosmetic product.
I could also imagine a lot of people being really disappointed by what they get back from their wedding photographer if they ask for something like this, because as Ollie was saying, that art isn't necessarily associated with wedding photographers, and also it's one of the last areas of photography that is quite lucrative. But the job is as much about direction and cajoling people into appropriate poses as it is about framing the shot. And I think if you asked most photographers who aren't used to either street photography or art photography or those sorts of candid poses to try and replicate what Ian Weldon has produced, you're not going to get anything like that quality.
Okay, I'm going to authentically and honestly call time on this edition of The Week Unwrapped. I'm going to head off to find these promised candid shots of Cameron. My thanks to Holden Frith, Hollie Clemence and Cameron Tait. You can capture the best and worst sides of our splendid team of Week Unwrappers when you subscribe. Do that through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your shows. TikTok, inevitably, one day. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.